sides of power and two sides of love, but one of my colleagues pointed out to me that if I really want to see this at the simplest possible level, just look at traditionally constructed gender relations. So you have the man, traditional role of the man, go out to work every morning. The generative side of his power is that he can build something in the world. But the degenerative side of his power, which is the subject of 100 books and 100 films, is he can become so focused on what he's got to do, this mission he has, that he becomes disconnected from his colleagues, his family. He becomes a robot and a tyrant. And the same about the historically constructed role of the woman, staying at home. The generative side of her love is she literally gives life to the children and figuratively to the family, but the degenerative side of her love is that she can become so focused on keeping the unity of the family that she undermines the power of the family members, and most particularly undermines her own power. So this is the essence of the analysis of my book. What is it that makes power degenerative rather than generative? It is the lack of love. And what is it that makes love degenerative rather than generative? It is the lack of power. And this basic symmetry is what was pointed out by Martin Luther King Jr., who was a student of Paul Tillich, and who said in one of his final speeches before he was assassinated, he said, "What we need to realize is that power without love is reckless and abusive." So the drive to self-realization without connection is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. This connection without power is sentimental and anemic. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our time. Now, the great biographer of Martin Luther King was a man named Taylor Branch, and he describes King's life as being a narrow path. On the one hand, trying to avoid the danger of recklessness and abuse, power without love, and on the other hand, trying to avoid this danger of love without power, sentimentality and anemia. And I think this image of a narrow path is very helpful and really is the core image that I want to emphasize. And, there's a famous Greek myth about this, which is the myth of Scylla and Charybdis. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus has to sail a narrow path between two land masses. On one side is Scylla, which is a six-headed monster with long neck and sharp teeth. That's Scylla. She's on the rocks. She's standing on the rocks. And on the other side is Charybdis, which is this sea monster that when she sucks in water forms a whirlpool. This is the origin of the expression between a rock and a whirlpool. And the Odysseus had to sail a narrow path because if he tried to get away from Scylla, he'd end up Charybdis. If he tried to get away from Charybdis, he'd end up Scylla. So this notion that we have to find a way to avoid power without love and to avoid love without power, we have to do both of them. So again, in theory, this is simple, but in practice, it's difficult and dangerous. And the reason is because in many cases, our societies and our communities and our organizations tend to be dominated either by power or by love, which means that they tend to be characterized either by recklessness and abuse or by sentimentality and anemia. They tend to end up either on the rocks or in the whirlpool. Choosing either power or love is always a mistake. When we choose either power or love, we get stuck. And if we want to get unstuck, if we want to move forward on addressing complex social challenges, we have to choose both. The big question, and this is the second point I wanted to make this evening, the big question is, how do we do this? How do we choose both? How do how do we, as people concerned with social leadership, as leaders or people who are trying to make a difference in the world, how can we learn to employ and indeed embody both power and love? Now, the reason this is difficult is that most of us are more comfortable with either one or the other. You've got your power people and you've got your love people. Now, in a nice, calm lecture hall like this, it's easy for us to imagine how we could employ both. But under pressure, we tend to revert to our comfort zone. Some people under pressure revert to power. Other people under pressure revert to love. My own pattern, which I talk about in the second chapter of the book, and a story about a very high-pressure undertaking in India, is that I was reckless and abusive on even-numbered days and sentimental and anemic on odd-numbered days. And the main point here, which is, again, simple conceptually but difficult practically, is that power and love constitute not a choice but a dilemma. And there's a man named Charles Hamilton Turner who's written about dilemmas, and he makes the point that typically the resolution of a dilemma involves not necessarily trying to do them